Disturbing discovery, cops find evil husband's murder footage. The silence in the room was suffocating. Detective Simmons stood still, staring at the small screen. His fingers hovered over the play button, but something held him back. A sense of dread washed over him, an icy chill creeping up his spine. The room felt too cold now. The glow of the screen reflected off his pale face, casting sharp shadows around his eyes. It was too still. Too quiet. He glanced at the other officers in the room. None of them spoke, their eyes glued to the screen, waiting. Simmons exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He hit play. The screen flickered, the image unstable at first. Then it stabilized. A woman's voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "Maggie," she said. Simmons' heart raced. He recognized the voice. It was her. The wife. The one who had vanished without a trace weeks ago. A low, guttural sound came from the speaker next. It was muffled, like someone was struggling. The camera angle shifted. The face of a man came into view. A twisted, bloodshot grin spread across his features. He wasn't looking at the camera. His gaze was focused on something off-screen. The woman's face appeared next, her eyes wide, terror-stricken. Her hands were bound. Her lips moved, but no sound came from the speakers. The man's laugh echoed, deep and mocking. He brought a knife into the frame. Simmons flinched, but didn't look away. The officers beside him shifted uneasily, their expressions pale. The man held the knife close to her throat, taunting her. The woman's eyes filled with tears, pleading silently. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Then, with a swift motion, the man struck. The screen blurred with the chaos of the moment. The last thing visible was the woman's lifeless gaze. Simmons felt his stomach turn. He couldn't breathe. He didn't want to watch, but his body refused to move. He stared at the screen, numb. The video ended. The room was deathly quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what they had just seen pressed down on them all. The silence hung like a heavy shroud. Simmons wiped his forehead, but his hand trembled. He tried to steady his breath, but the air felt thick. His mind raced. How could this be? How could anyone be so monstrous? His eyes scanned the room, but no one met his gaze. The officers were still in shock, staring at the blank screen. No one dared to speak. Simmons stood motionless, his fingers twitching at his side. A shiver ran through him. He took a step back, his boots clicking sharply on the concrete floor. Then another. His feet felt like they were sinking into the ground. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. He forced his eyes away from the screen, but the images lingered. The blood. The knife. The woman's wide, unblinking eyes. His stomach churned. "Jesus," one of the officers muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Simmons could barely hear him, but the words hit him like a slap. He wanted to scream, but his throat was tight. He turned toward the door, needing to escape. But something stopped him. A single thought clawed at his mind. The man in the video. He was still out there. Simmons forced himself to breathe. The room felt suffocating, closing in around him. He needed answers. He needed to move. But where? The officers gathered around. Simmons stood frozen, staring at the timestamp on his phone. It didn't make sense. How could they have missed this? How could they have been so blind? The room spun, the walls closing in. He looked up, his eyes scanning the faces of the officers again. Something was wrong. Something was horribly wrong. Daniel stepped back, his face pale. The others seemed to shift uncomfortably, avoiding Simmons' gaze. Simmons' breath became shallow, ragged. The quiet tension in the room thickened, suffocating him. His heart hammered in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" he muttered, barely able to hear his own voice. Daniels blinked, confused, his face contorted in disbelief. "I don't know what you're talking about, Simmons." But Simmons could see it now, something in Daniels' eyes. The way his gaze darted around the room, never settling. He was hiding something. Simmons took a step closer, his voice low, dangerous. "How long have you known?" Daniels' face went even paler. "What are you implying?" he asked, his voice shaking. The other officers shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking toward the door, then back to Simmons. Simmons' mind was spinning now, his thoughts too fast to catch. He turned sharply, his eyes landing on the lone officer in the corner, Officer Harris. Harris had been quiet throughout the whole ordeal. Almost too quiet. Simmons' gut twisted. He knew Harris had been close to the case. But had he been too close? The room felt colder. Too cold. Simmons approached Harris slowly, his voice a low whisper. "Did you know, Harris? Were you a part of this?" Harris flinched, then straightened up. "Not what you think," he muttered quickly, looking away. But it was too late. Simmons had seen enough. The lies. The hesitation. It all added up. He was surrounded by them. The officers who were supposed to help. But now they were the problem. Simmons' pulse quickened as his hand hovered over his gun. He needed to get out. But they wouldn't let him. Daniels moved toward the door, blocking it. "We can't let you go, Simmons." The words hung in the air. His heart sank. This was bigger than he realized. They were all part of it. The husband. The officers. It had been a game from the start. And Simmons had been the pawn. Simmons' breath caught in his throat. His hand instinctively went to his holster, fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. But something stopped him. A cold, sharp realization washed over him, they already knew star. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. Daniels' stance was firm, but not aggressive. He wasn't blocking the door just to stop Simmons from leaving. It was something more. Something darker. "Step away from the door, Daniels," Simmons said, his voice steady but laced with tension. Daniels didn't budge. "We can't let you go, Simmons," he repeated, his words like a slow drip of poison. Simmons took a slow step forward, trying to control the trembling in his legs. Every muscle in his body was screaming to move, but he stayed still, calculating. Harris, still in the corner, didn't even flinch. He just watched, his expression unreadable. A wave of anger surged through Simmons, but beneath it, fear gnawed at him. "Why?" he spat, unable to mask the hurt in his voice. Daniels' eyes flickered to Harris, then back to Simmons. "Because we're not the ones who've been fooled, Simmons," he said, his tone cold, methodical. Simmons' head swam, but he didn't dare let his mind wander. He needed answers. "Then who?" Simmons' voice broke off as his eyes locked with Harris. Harris finally spoke, his voice low and flat. "It's over, Simmons. You should have known better." The words hit Simmons like a punch to the stomach. "Over?" Simmons whispered, his voice trembling. Harris nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth curling into something almost like a smirk. "You were never meant to find him," Daniels added, the edge of menace creeping into his voice. Simmons felt the weight of those words press down on him. His pulse thundered in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about?" Simmons demanded, his voice rising. But they didn't answer. Instead, Daniels moved a step closer, his eyes never leaving Simmons. "Think about it, Simmons," Daniels said, his voice dangerously calm. "You've been chasing shadows. Chasing ghosts. The whole time." Simmons shook his head, his thoughts a blur. No. This can't be real, The images of Maggie, the twisted smile of her husband, and the horror they'd just watched, all seemed to swirl together. Was it all just a setup? A trap? The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. His breath became shallow, ragged. And then it hit him. The truth. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The recording wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. A promise. The man on that screen, Maggie's husband, was never going to be found. Not by him. Not by anyone. Because the Real killers were standing right in front of him. He had been part of their game all along. And now, it was too late to escape. The last thing Simmons saw was Daniels reaching for his own gun. And then, everything went black. Simmons' body went rigid as the cold steel of the gun pressed against his temple. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The room swam around him in dizzying circles, everything feeling like it was spinning out of control. Daniel's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You should have stayed away from this case, Simmons." Simmons' mind raced, but everything felt too slow. The sharp click of a safety being released echoed in his ears. The officers around him remained still, silent. There was no escape. Simmons tried to gather his thoughts, but they were slipping through his fingers. His fingers twitched at his side, searching for his gun. But the weight of the truth was heavier than any weapon. He had been wrong from the start. The husband, the murderer, wasn't the only villain here. He never was. Simmons had been a pawn in a much darker game. The officers in this room had been part of it all along. He was the last piece to fall into place. Simmons swallowed hard, his throat dry, but his voice still came out, shaky. "Why?" Daniel's lips curled into a thin smile, the coldness in his eyes sending a shiver down Simmons' spine. "You don't get it, do you, Simmons?" Daniel said, the words dripping with contempt. "This was never about Maggie." Simmons blinked, confusion clouding his mind. It wasn't about Maggie? His stomach twisted. Then what was it about? "We were watching you," Daniels continued, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We knew you were getting close. Too close." The truth hit Simmons with the force of a sledgehammer. The whole time, they had been tracking him. They had known every move he made. Every step he took. He was never in control. His heart pounded painfully in his chest. It was all a trap. A game. And Simmons had been their final piece. Simmons' pulse spiked as he thought of the recording again, the twisted smile, the blade pressed to Maggie's throat. It wasn't just the husband who had filmed it. They all had. They were all complicit. Tears stung at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. There was no redemption left. He had walked right into their web. His throat tightened, but he managed to speak again. "You were, all of you, in on it." Daniel's smile widened. "Always. From the start." Before Simmons could react, the sound of a door opening behind him startled him. It was Harris. Harris stepped forward, his hand clutching a folder, his expression unreadable. Simmons' gaze darted to Harris, and then to Daniels. "What now?" Simmons whispered, his voice trembling. "We finish it," Daniels said, his voice calm, unfeeling. The cold barrel pressed tighter against Simmons' temple, the pressure building in his head. Simmons closed his eyes for a brief moment, unable to fight the overwhelming surge of despair. The truth was undeniable now. There was no escape. The room felt impossibly small. His chest constricted, his breath shallow. And then, with a single, deafening shot, the world went dark. The silence in the room was deafening. Simmons' body slumped to the floor, lifeless. His head hit the cold concrete with a sickening thud, but no one moved. The officers stood still, frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped. Daniels didn't flinch. Harris remained expressionless. The gunshot echoed in Simmons' mind long after the sound had faded. It was over. The game was finished. But the room was thick with something else now. A quiet satisfaction. Daniels exhaled slowly, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, his hand steady. He looked down at Simmons' body, his eyes cold, emotionless. "That's how it had to be," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Harris nodded, his gaze flicking toward the door. "We'll clean it up," Harris said flatly. Daniels didn't respond. He turned his attention back to the recording still playing on the screen, the image of Maggie's wide, terror-filled eyes still fresh in his mind. For a moment, Daniels let the silence wash over him, the weight of everything settling in. But then he glanced at Harris again. "It's done," Daniels said, his voice devoid of anything but finality. Harris met his eyes briefly, then turned and walked toward the door. The others followed, leaving Daniels alone in the room with the body. With the echoes of the past. Daniels stared at the screen once more, at the twisted, haunting grin of the man they had hunted. The killer wasn't the one they thought. It never had been. It was always the ones who wore the badges. Always the ones who promised to protect. The door clicked shut behind him, and Daniels was alone with the truth. A truth he had never intended to be discovered. And as the last of the officers left, the light in the room flickered. The shadows seemed to stretch long and dark across the walls. The game was over. But it wasn't over for them. Not by a long shot. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the empty room. Daniels stood motionless, the stillness pressing down on him like a heavy weight. His heart beat slowly, almost painfully, as if trying to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. The body of Simmons lay on the floor, lifeless, a silent reminder of their success. But the triumph didn't feel like triumph. It felt hollow. Empty. Daniels wiped his palms on his pants, then glanced at the recording once more. The image of Maggie's face flickered in his mind, her eyes wide with terror. Was it worth it? The question nagged at him, but he shoved it aside. There was no room for weakness now. No room for doubt. The game had been played, and they had won. But the darkness in the room seemed to creep closer, suffocating him, choking the air from his lungs. Daniels took a slow, deliberate step toward the door, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. He was about to leave when something made him stop. The screen flashed again. A new image. A new file. Daniels froze, his breath catching in his throat. The timestamp. It was recent. The recording wasn't from months ago. It was from today. His pulse quickened as he stared at the new file. This wasn't part of the plan. His eyes darted to the doorway. He could hear Harris's footsteps fading down the hall. But this was something different. Something far worse. Daniels reached for the mouse, his fingers trembling as he clicked the play button. The screen flickered once more, revealing a darkened room. There was a figure in the corner. A figure with their back turned to the camera. Daniels' stomach twisted. He recognized the silhouette. It was Harris. But this time, Harris wasn't alone. In the chair next to him was another officer. Officer Reed. The one who had been with them from the start. Daniels' throat tightened. Reed's face was hidden, but the muffled sound of their conversation echoed through the speakers. It was low, indistinct. Until Harris's voice cut through the static. Everything is in place. He won't last much longer. Daniels' blood ran cold. His eyes locked on the screen. This wasn't the end. It wasn't over. The game was just beginning. Suddenly, a sharp click from behind him made him spin around. The door was open again. Daniels' heart skipped a beat. Harris stood there, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. "You're not done yet, Daniels," Harris said softly. The words hung in the air, chilling Daniels to the core. He took a step back, realizing the truth too late. He wasn't in control. Not anymore. And now, the real game was about to begin. Daniels' mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. He took a step back, eyes wide, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But Harris didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, the shadows swallowing him whole, his eyes unblinking, unreadable. Daniels opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. "What is this?" Daniels' voice came out hoarse, desperate. Harris's lips curled into a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "You were never meant to walk away from this, Daniels, he said, his voice smooth, like the sound of ice scraping against glass. Daniels felt his stomach drop. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. Harris had known all along. This was never just about the case. It had never been just about Simmons. It had always been about them. About Harris and the others, working in the shadows, pulling the strings. And now, Daniels was tangled in their web. His breath came quicker, his skin clammy. He looked at the recording again, the figures on the screen, the words still echoing in his mind. Asterisk, everything is in place. He won't last much longer, asterisk. Daniels swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Why? He whispered. Harris stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed through the emptiness. Because we knew, Harris said, stepping closer, his voice low and unshaken. We knew you were too focused on the wrong things. You were obsessed with finding the husband, but you never looked at what was right in front of you. Daniels took another step back, his mind spinning, but his feet were frozen. You manipulated me? Daniels choked out. Harris's grin widened, the cold gleam in his eyes making Daniels' blood run cold. Not manipulated, Daniels, Harris replied. No. We trained you. We let you get close enough to think you were winning. The words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. Training. He had been a part of something so much darker than he could have ever imagined. Everything you thought you knew, Harris continued, stepping even closer, was just part of the plan. A plan you couldn't see because you were too busy chasing ghosts. Daniels' pulse throbbed in his ears, his hands trembling, but he couldn't look away. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. You think you're the first to get this far? Harris sneered. You're just the latest in a long line of people who thought they could uncover the truth. The ones who thought they could stop us. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came. This can't be real. But it was. The fear, the cold dread, asterisk, it was real, star. And then, Harris did something that made Daniels' blood run even colder. Harris reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. Daniels' eyes widened as Harris tossed the folder onto the table in front of him. The folder was thick, well-worn, the edges frayed. A name was stamped on the front in bold, black letters, Daniels. Daniels' breath hitched as he opened it. Inside were photographs. Old ones. New ones. His own face, captured from angles he never remembered. Surveillance. His chest tightened as he flipped through the pages, each one more incriminating than the last. This was never just about the case, Daniels thought. This was about me. You've been a part of something much bigger than you realized, Daniels, Harris said, his voice now full of chilling finality. And now you're part of the game too. Daniels felt his legs give way. He collapsed into the chair, the weight of the truth sinking in like a stone in his chest. There was no escape. No redemption. Not for him. Not for anyone who had crossed their path. Harris leaned in, his cold breath brushing Daniels' ear. You're the last piece, Harris whispered. And now, we'll see how far you'll go to play. The room grew darker, the walls closing in, and Daniels knew, asterisk, it was too late, star. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Daniels could barely breathe, the weight of the folder in his hands pulling him deeper into the abyss. His fingers trembled, the photographs blurring in his vision. Asterisk, they had been watching him. All along, asterisk. He couldn't make sense of it. Everything he had ever believed was shattering. His entire career, his purpose, it was all just a game to them. Harris stood before him, looming like a dark figure, his eyes cold and unblinking. You think you've been in control, Harris said, his voice quiet, almost sympathetic. You were never in control, Daniels. Not once. Daniels' throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But his body wouldn't obey. Every muscle was frozen, as if the truth itself had paralyzed him. The door was still closed. The walls were closing in. And Harris. Harris was still standing there, smiling like he'd won. Because he had. Daniels blinked rapidly, trying to force the reality of it all to sink in. Asterisk, he was part of this. Part of them. Part of the game, asterisk. But no matter how much he tried to fight it, the truth was undeniable. The dark web of manipulation, lies, and deceit had snared him just as easily as it had snared Simmons. And there was no way out. Do you understand now? Harris asked, taking a step closer. Daniels felt a tremor ripple through him, but he couldn't speak. The air in the room was thick, too thick. It pressed against him, making it harder to think. Everything had been planned from the start. You were never meant to be the hero, Daniels, Harris continued, his voice smooth and condescending. You were a tool. A pawn. Just like all the others who came before you. Daniels felt his mind spin. The cases. The people. The evidence. It was all a setup. He wasn't hunting criminals. He was being hunted. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he gasped for air. You have a choice, Harris said, almost casually. Daniels' head snapped up. A choice? His voice cracked, a pitiful sound in the quiet room. Sure, Harris said, his lips curling into a grin. You can either join us, or you can disappear like Simmons did. Daniels swallowed hard, his pulse racing. Join them? It was a decision he didn't want to make. But in that moment, staring at the cruel smirk on Harris's face, he knew there was no way out. Not really. You're going to be the one who cleans up the mess, Harris said, his voice cold and final. The rest of them, they won't last much longer either. One by one, they'll fall. Daniel's chest tightened at the words, but there was a strange calm beginning to settle over him. There was no running from this. He had been a part of this game since the moment he joined. And now, he was part of the final act. Harris reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm, almost possessive. It's time, Daniels, he said softly. The game is over for you. Daniels blinked, the room spinning again. The realization hit him all at once, they had won. He had never been a hero. And he never would be. The game had ended with them in control. And Daniels? He was just another piece on their board. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to dance around him. There was no escaping now. And as the door behind him creaked open, Daniels knew it wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the end. The game had come to its final, inevitable conclusion. And Daniels was its last, unwilling player. Daniels stood at the edge of the room, the weight of Harris's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. His hand still gripped the folder, the photographs inside now nothing more than evidence of his own complicity. He tried to breathe, but the air felt too thin, too cold. His head swam, and his pulse was a dull throb in his temples. Behind him, the door creaked open again. The soft sound should have been mundane, but it pierced through him like a knife. Slowly, Harris moved to the side, stepping aside to reveal a dark figure silhouetted in the doorway. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It was someone he didn't expect. Someone he had trusted. Lieutenant Clark. Her face was impassive, but her eyes were cold, calculating. She stepped into the room, her boots clicking sharply on the concrete floor. I see you've met Harris, Clark said, her tone flat, almost bored. Daniel's throat tightened. He had been in the dark about so much, but now, it was all becoming clear. Clark had been part of it. The whole time. Clark, Daniels whispered, barely able to get the words out. You too? She nodded once, her gaze hardening as she stepped closer. Of course. Did you think we wouldn't notice your little investigation, Daniels? Your scrutiny. You've been digging around in places you shouldn't have. That's dangerous. Daniels wanted to move, to shout, to break free of this nightmare, but his legs were weak beneath him. He felt trapped, suffocated, like he was suffocating on the truth. Why? His voice was hoarse, desperate. Why not? Clark replied with a shrug, as if the question itself was too trivial. The world is full of people like you, Daniels. People who think they can fix things. They think they can stop us. She sneered, crossing her arms. But you can't. You never could. Daniel's mind raced, but it was too late. He knew what was coming next. The realization struck him like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. They were the puppeteers. And he? He was nothing more than a puppet. Clark's lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Welcome to the game, she said, her voice almost a whisper. And in that moment, Daniels understood. It had never been about justice. It had never been about the law. It was always about control. And now, it was his turn to play. The door slammed shut behind him, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the flickering lights above. Daniels stood frozen, his mind a blur, struggling to make sense of everything that had just unraveled. The walls seemed to close in around him as the full weight of the situation pressed against his chest. Harris remained still, his cold eyes never leaving Daniels' face. The smile had faded, replaced by something darker, something more calculating. Clark, too, stood like a shadow, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Daniel's fingers trembled, the folders still clutched tightly in his hand. The photographs were a reminder of his descent into this nightmare. They weren't just pictures, they were the final, damning evidence of his failure. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Why, he had been so sure. So convinced that he was on the right side of this battle. But now? Now, he understood. There was no right side. The door was closed. The game was over for him. I don't understand, Daniels managed, his voice barely more than a whisper. How did it all go so wrong? Clark's eyes flickered with something akin to pity, but her voice was sharp when she spoke. Because, Daniels, she said, you never understood who you were really up against. Harris stepped forward then, his presence looming. You were just a part of the bigger plan. A cog in the machine. You were never going to find the answers, not on your own. His voice was low, almost comforting in its finality. You're here because you were supposed to be here. Daniels staggered backward, his mind racing for a way out. There had to be something, some way to escape this, some mistake they'd made. But there was nothing. Then why didn't you just kill me? Daniels choked out. Because we wanted to see how far you'd go, Clark replied, her eyes cold and indifferent. To see how far you could push before you broke. Daniels closed his eyes, feeling the crushing weight of the truth. He had pushed too far. The game had been rigged from the start, and now there was no escape. The finality of it hit him. He wasn't in control. He never had been. And as the door swung open one last time, revealing only the darkness beyond, Daniels realized there was no longer any fight left in him. The game was over. And he had lost.